Well, fellow psychonauts, I'm honored to be amongst my tribe. So that was spectacular. That was so well done. And I'm so honored to be here today. It's been a long journey. I'm really honored also that there's some special guests in the audience. I want to first put a great acknowledgement out to my professor, Dr. Michael Bug, that you'll be hearing about. Michael, are you in the audience? Could you stand up? Okay. Excellent. And then we have several of the merry pranksters here. We have Mountain Girl. Mountain Girl, I don't know where you are, but big shout out to you. We have Sunshine Kesey here, and we have also George Walker as well. So there you are. Well, so let's rock and roll. If we get the lights back down, I'd appreciate it. So this has been quite the journey. It has been a long, strange trip. And it's a long, strange trip to the paradigm shift. And I think we are here today at a critical point in the evolution of human history. But I like to look at things from an evolutionary perspective. But before I jump into my talk, I'd like to talk about this hat. And this hat is made from a amadou mushroom. It's a hard wood conch that grows on birch trees. And it actually is made from some ladies in Transylvania. And this hat allowed for the portability, or this mushroom allowed for the portability of fire. It's a tinder conch. The Latin name is Fomes fomentarius. It's a birch polypore. You can hollow a hole into this mushroom and put embers of fire and carry it for days. It allowed for the portability of fire. There's no doubt that we all came from Africa. We traveled north. We discovered something new called winter. Oops. And if your clan cannot keep fire alive, your clan would perish. Now, this is an example of a thread of knowledge that literally goes back thousands and thousands of years. How many threads of knowledge have been frayed and cut because of war, religion, persecution, disease? For lots of reasons. But the fact that we are here today is because of very smart choices on the evolutionary path. And our co-evolution with fungi extends not just to the polypore mushrooms like amadou, but is intimately connected, I believe, with our experiences with psilocybin mushrooms. So I like to look at this from an evolutionary perspective. So I'm a big nerd on evolution. And so I want to first get on the same page of what mushrooms are. They're the reproductive structures of fungi. There are about 2.5 million species of fungi estimated now in the kingdom of fungi, outnumbering plants about 6 to 1. About 150,000 species are mushroom-forming fungi. That means they have fleshy reproductive structures that are visible to the naked eye. And they produce spores, and so that's the definition of a mushroom. We've identified about 14,000 species to date. That means about less than 10% of the mushroom-forming fungi out there we've actually identified based on DNA analysis. Now, a simplified view of the mushroom life cycle: spores come together. If they're compatible sexually, they mate. The mycelium then becomes binucleate, 2 nuclei per cell. The downstream mycelium, after many, many months, weeks, sometimes years of navigating through a microbial hostile environment, then is triggered into mushroom formation. The mushrooms come up, but they're highly perishable. They only exist for a few days. Now, think of this. That which is so powerful and yet so ephemeral. Some mushrooms can kill you, some can feed you, some can heal you, some can send you on a spiritual journey. But that which is so powerful and so ephemeral, it's natural for humans to avoid or be afraid of them, because our contact with animals and other plants, we have a long-term exposure, weeks, months, years, so we have a familiarity factor. But mushrooms being so powerful, especially the magic mushrooms, only the cognoscente, a very select group of individuals within a clan or a tribe or a people, would have the experiential knowledge, and to be able to transfer that knowledge was a sacred transmission from one generation to the next. So this is the mycelium growing over about 5 days. This is a Psilocybin cubensis. And as mycelium grows, it constantly forks. The largest organism in the world known today is a mycelial mat in eastern Oregon, 2,200 acres in size. It's a honey mushroom called Armillaria stoi. And it's killed the trees, and this is why the Forest Service has cut down the forest. Actually, this is the photograph that I took. I hired an airplane from Boeing Field. I went there. I had the latitude and longitude coordinates based on a scientific article. We flew. We couldn't find it. We found lots of dead forests because this honey mushroom kills the forest. The trees become ashen gray. They could start fires, and so the Forest Service cuts them down because of fire danger. So we couldn't find it. And I went back and we checked the lat long. We were right there, but we were too low in elevation. So we went back the next day, and this little small airplane I hired had actually canvas skin on it, and we go there, and we went circled up higher and higher. We got to 14,500 feet, and I could see it, but I told the pilot, I think I'm going to faint. And the pilot said, me too. I said, I need to get a photograph. So I took this photograph, which still I think is the best photograph of the largest organism in the world is a mycelial mat, and it's only one cell wall thick. Now think of that. We have 5 or 6 skin layers that protect us from an infection. The mycelium has one. And on the other side of that cell wall, growing through the soil, there's millions of microbes, that many of which are eager to consume the mycelium. So the mycelium forms mushrooms in response to 4 primary environmental stimuli. One is the introduction of water. We all know that. The rains have come to Oregon. We'll have mushrooms. And then we have water. Then from rain, we have evaporative cooling. We have evaporation, so drop in temperature is the second one. The third one is when the mycelium comes near to the surface, it exhales carbon dioxide, inhales oxygen. That's the third. And the fourth is light. The vast majority of mushrooms are phototropic, photosensitive. They have to have light exposure in order for the mushrooms to be triggered, to be formed from the mycelium. So the mycelium does form primordia, and the primordia then are rapidly growing. Just, they literally appear sometimes overnight. That's why they're so bizarre. And this is why the field of mycology, and specifically of mushrooms, I know of no field that is understudied, underrepresented, underutilized, and underappreciated, and yet has such a powerful potential for doing a lot of the good and giving us the solutions that we so desperately need today. So the mycelium forms primarily for most species in response to blue light, 320 to 400 nanometers. Many of the psilocybin mushroom cultures, psilocybe cultures, don't have any detectable psilocybin in them until they're exposed to blue light. And that blue light triggers primordial formation, and that then upregulates the formation and the production of psilocybin in the mycelium. So looking at a mushroom, this is a russula in an old-growth forest meadow. A few days later, the spores are germinating, lots of things are happening, lots of other organisms are now decomposing the mushrooms. And then a few days later, my foot here covers approximately 300 to 600 miles of mycelium. And a single cubic inch takes me 1 to 8 miles of these cells. Now think of that. These are extensive membranes that are literally under every footstep that we take. We leave impressions on the ecosystem. I propose to you those impressions are felt by the mycelium underneath our feet. They respond to catastrophia, and we're the greatest walking catastrophe I know of. And as we walk across the landscape, we break wood. And the wood chips then that are exposed and our newly available nutrition, the mycelium races after us. But curiously, the majority of psilocybin mushrooms that grow in wood chips are very rare in the forest until you create wood chips. And so with human habits of chopping wood and building buildings, there's this surge of these psilocybin mushrooms coming out of the genome of the nature, heretofore not seen. This came presented hugely focused with Michael Bugin, myself, and other researchers, because many of the scientists at the University of Washington and Oregon and California had not seen these mushrooms until landscaping wood chips were applied around buildings. And they were caught aghast. They have never seen these species. They've been studying them for decades, and they didn't see them until wood chips were provided around as landscaping materials around universities, law enforcement facilities, courthouses, and then increasingly computer companies. So these psilocybin mushrooms tend to follow the debris fields that humans are creating. That may not be accidental. They may be purposeful. The mycelium produces extracellular metabolites. This is a subject of a lot of my research recently. This recent article in Science identified more than 1,000 species of bacteria in a single gram of soil. So as the mycelium grows, it's producing antibiotics, it selects the microbiome, it selects the landscape, it starts the ecosystem evolution, and it sets the the microbiome that gives rise to the plant communities that create the debris fields that feed the mycelium that ensures the progeny of the survival of the species. These are deterministic organisms. They are smart. They look at landscape and the animals in the landscape as whether they can continue their destiny, and they engage us to be involved. So looking at the mycelium in an electron microscope, I spent many years as a scanning electron microscopist. The mycelium and the organization of the mycelium has a beautiful architecture that cannot be damaged by concussion, by breaking the mycelium. When you break the mycelium, it forks, it regrows. This is some microscopic movies by my friend Patrick Hickey. Prior to this, we did not know that these nuclei flow through the networks as bundles. And as the mycelium grows out, the breadth of my arms, actually Nicholas Money helped me do this calculation, more than 8 trillion end branches in a meter diameter of mycelium can occur, and at the tips they become multinucleate. And because they're multinucleate at the tip, think of the little scientists exploring, and because epigenesis, the coding of new enzymes, acids, antibiotics, if there is that new expression out of the genome, and they successfully then find a new food source, what happens? The mycelium surges and consumes it, and that information then becomes resident within the body intellect of the mycelium. These are self-learning membranes. So they are not only exhaling carbon dioxide, inhaling oxygen in externalized lungs. These are not only able to externalize stomachs, digesting nutrients externally, but these are also self-learning membranes. They have an intelligence network built within them. And so I'm going to wax poetic here, but the longer and I study this subject, the more I believe this is true. There's some self-apparent truths that as you voyage with psilocybin into the MycoVerse, these truths become very, very clear, and something that I think is universal to the foundation of nature. The mycelium has the architecture that's similar to the architecture of that of neurons, of that of the computer internet. And let's go back to the origin of the universe, of the Big Bang. 13.8 billion years ago, the universe was formed. And then after the Big Bang, matter organized into networks. This is from the Max Planck Institute. When I saw this, it took my breath away. The largest expansive view of the universe today, we look at it, and it also conforms that of the archetype of that of the mycelium. And then, as the galaxies form, this is the Deep Hubble telescope view. East of those ellipses are galaxies. They're literally, trillions upon trillions of galaxies. And the probability of network-based organisms, I think, is a reality that we need to accept. I believe matter begets life. Life becomes single cells branch. They become networks, they fork. You have membranes. And then you have intersecting mosaics of network-based organisms that collaborate and compete. I think this is the way. This is the way of being. This is the way of who we are and where we came from and where we are going. So we go to the beginning of the formation of the Earth 4.5 billion years ago. And then many of you may not know that there was a planetoid called Theia. And when Theia, right after the Earth was formed, about 4.5 billion years ago, a few 100 million years later, a planetoid struck the Earth. And debris was jettisoned, coalesced, and formed our moon. This is why the Apollo astronauts, when they came back with samples from the moon, the scientists were astonished that the mineral profiles were exactly that of the Earth. The moon came from the Earth. And then the first organism known so far is 3.8 billion years ago. It's called Luca. All hail Luca! I'm sorry. Down, Sims. It's the last universal common ancestor from which all life today is thought to be descendant. Recently, this past year, a fossilized mycelium was found in lava beds in South Africa 2.4 billion years ago. The oldest record so far of a multicellular organism on this planet is mycelium. Now, animals split from fungi more than 600 million years ago, 1.8 billion years later. There's a new super kingdom scientists have erected called a Psilocybin. It's when fungi and animalia were joined together. And then fungi continued on its path, and fungi gave birth to animals. We are descendant from fungi. We are descendant from mycelium. This is why our best antibiotics are active against bacteria, but not against fungi, because the antibiotics against fungi harm us because of our close evolutionary relationship. We progressed forward to 420 million to 356 million years ago, and a fossil was found in 1843. It was given the name Prototaxides. It was a very controversial for a long time until Dr. Kevin Boyce at the University of Chicago and his colleagues were able to identify, in fact, Prototaxides. This is before vascular plants, before flying insects. This is before trees. The largest organism on this planet, towering 30 to 40 feet in height, were these giant fungi, Prototaxides. This is well before our large animals had formed and evolved. It would attract lightning because of the higher elevation. Epigenesis would be occurring. Lots of evolutionary selective pressures and stimulation would be occurring. These things would also, of course, invite microbiomes that set up the stage for ecological evolution. So we go forward now to 250 million years ago. And now we have another celestial visitor. An asteroid comes out of the cosmos, comes down and strikes the Earth, and bam! Huge amounts of debris are jettisoned in the atmosphere. The atmosphere is cloaked with dust, sunlight is cut off. Animals and plants die. 75% to 90% of the species on the planet died from this event, and fungi inherited the Earth. In fact, at the PT boundary, it's very easy to see in the geological record, the Permian-Triassic boundary 250 million years ago. In the fossil record, at that junction, a fungus predominated. In fact, it was given a name by scientists called Reduviosporinides. And so this is the fungus that's resident in the fossil record that gobbled up the forest that had been destroyed, from the impact of this asteroid. Now we go forward to the time of Pangaea and Gondwana land, and we have the separation of the continents. And I still remember in the 3rd grade raising my hand to my teacher in geology class saying, "Teacher, it looks like it's a puzzle. You could all put it together." And she goes, "No, that's a coincidence." I think scientists need to listen to 3rd graders more often, right? So this is the present. And then this past year, found in the sediments in Brazil, 110 million years ago, is the first, putatively, the first and the oldest fossilized mushroom. It's a guild mushroom. It actually kind of looks like Psilocybin cubensis. No one's going to go that far. But it is a cap and stem mushroom with gills. The mushrooms are highly perishable, so finding something that's fossilized this old is extraordinary. 110 million years ago, mushrooms had their form well before we had ours. I want you to look anew at mushrooms when you see them. These are elders. These are ancient organisms that have existed long before primates had developed. And us, we have developed our forms. So we go forward to 65 million years ago, and we have another celestial visitor. Another asteroid comes out of the cosmos, comes down to the Earth and strikes just above the Yucatan. Kaboom! Another huge catastrophe, extinction event. The dinosaurs become extinct, jettisoned into the atmosphere as huge debris fields. The Earth is shrouded in dust. Plants, animals die, and fungi re-inherit the Earth. We have now entered into 6X, the 6th greatest extinction event known in the history of life on this planet. There's 8.3 million species estimated on this planet, and we're losing more than 30,000 species a year. Do the math. In 100 years, that's more than 30% of the diversity on this planet that got us here today. We are experiencing an extinction event of dramatic proportions. If we don't protect the biodiversity on this planet, we are likely not only to be the cause of this extinction event, but to be its victim. We need to look at the 7th generation model that First Peoples and Native Americans have been espousing for years. What is the consequence of our actions throughout time to downstream generations? Even conservative Christians, in the Bible, you're supposed to leave the environment in a better state of condition than you inherited for your children. We have lost that message. So we are here today, and then primates have evolved. So let's look at some of these primates. 23 primates, including humans, consume mushrooms. The Golgi monkey consumes more than 12% of its body weight. Now, if there's 23 primates that consumes mushrooms, knowing the differences between edible and poisonous ones, then that speaks to a long ancestral knowledge of not only contact with mushrooms, but how to understand them, to use them for survival. So they have a utilitarian purpose. And I believe that plants and mushrooms become shamanistically important because of a multiplicity of benefits. And so we go forward, and there's an extraordinary expansion of the human brain. 2 million, some people say 200,000. There's a general fluctuation in estimation. This is normal in science. But the human brain suddenly nearly doubled to tripled in its capacity. How is that possible? Well, there is a good hypothesis for this. And it's also was stimulated by climate change, where the epigenetic pressures for problem solving, for adapting to sudden change, would reward those organisms that were smarter, being able to strategize to survive these changing climates. And when you look at Homo erectus, came into Europe long before Homo sapiens. And curiously, when Homo sapiens came into Europe around 40,000 years ago, Homo erectus became extinct very quickly, but Neanderthals became extinct within 4,000 years of contact. Homo erectus and Neanderthals were inhabiting Europe well before the final human Homo sapien migration from Africa. So we made these other, human-like, primates extinct very, very rapidly. So how is it that we succeeded and they did not? Well, I want to present to you and revisit what Terence and Dennis McKenna proposed as a stoned ape theory. Now, I have a disagreement with them, but it's a legitimate academic disagreement. It's not a theory, it's a hypothesis. It's perhaps an improvable hypothesis. But I want you to suspend disbelief and any prejudice for or against this hypothesis, but just look at circumstantially, the probability of this occurring. So as climate change occurred and savannas increased, the forests declined, our primate ancestors descended out of the forest canopies and they marched across the savanna. When you're tracking animals, you look for scat, you look for footprints. The largest mushroom growing and very commonly in the subtropics is Psilocybin cubensis. You're hungry, the majority of primates are grub eaters, and maggots grow in rotted mushrooms. You consume these mushrooms with your clan. You have this amazing expansion of consciousness. You share it with your family because they're hungry. You have this joint experience of expanded consciousness, and then it causes epigenetic neurogenesis. The ability then suddenly of mind expansion, your concepts expand. We all know this. And so this may be the primary stimulus for the origination of Homo sapiens. Now, how often would this happen? Not once, not twice, not dozens, not hundreds, but millions upon millions upon millions of times over millions of years. That constant stimulation into the genome of humans is a very logical reason that the human brain suddenly expanded because of what I call epigenetic neurogenesis. So let's look at some of these Psilocybes. This is Psilocybin cubensis growing on elephant dung, and on the left there, Psilocybin cubensis growing on cow dung. It's on many ungulates, hippopotamus, zebra, horses, buffaloes, and it cohabits with another mushroom called Copelandia, cyanescens or bispora. And so if you don't find this one, you find this one. They're both potent psilocybin mushrooms. When you think about tracking and hunting animals, you would follow these ungulates across the prairie. You may not see them, but you'd find their dung. You'd find these mushrooms. You're being rewarded on your trek of exploration. This is a good carrot in front of your cart, you know. Honey, I didn't find the meat, but look at these mushrooms. You know? So the Stone Age hypothesis, psilocybin degrades into psilocin, which tightly binds and activates serotonin receptors, stimulating neurogenesis, improving visual acuity and hearing. Now, Terrence and I became good friends the last 5 years of his life. I really fell in love with Terrence when he started making fun of himself. He said, people take me so seriously. I go, yeah, they do, Terrence. But Dennis said something that I think is very profound. If only 5 to 10% of that which Terrence stated is true, then it's just so important for us to be able to contemplate. And this is what psychonauts do. They push the envelope of credibility. They use their imagination. The great thing about those of us who are independent thinkers, who don't have to worry about tenure at a college, who don't have to be worried being fired by the boss, we have the liberty, the academic liberty to explore and use our imagination. We don't have to be right every time. Because that 1 out of 10 times that we are right is paid for and legitimized by the many of the times that we were not right. This is how progress is made. It is not a theory. It's a hypothesis. A hypothesis is an educated guess to explain an observable phenomenon. A theory has been tested by science and factually supported. So maybe the Stone Age hypothesis, with all the research done clinically now, will become a theory. Will we be able to retroactively prove that psilocybin mushrooms resulted in the expansion of the human brain and human consciousness? I think that time is coming. So let's look at this in the scientific evidence that's out there. The effects of psilocybin on neurogenesis in the hippocampus and the fear of extinction of trace fear conditioning. This was done with mice where they had an auditory signal associated with pain. When they hear the signal later on, like Pavlov's dog, you know, they would cower in fear. Upon taking doses of psilocybin, they were able to disconnect and disassociate the auditory stimulus with a fear response, showing to be able to repattern their behavior through new channels of neurological transmission. Psilocybin induces courage, therefore, because you disassociate an environmental stimulus with fear, and kindness. I think that's important because those are leadership skills. Don't you want to have a leader that you know has courage and kindness? I think foremost in most all of our minds right now, we know of several leaders who could very much benefit from a high dose of psilocybin today. And it leads to better citizenship. Well, let's look at this. What does it mean? When we look at a connectogram, and I'd love this, Nancy Reagan, if you're still alive today. This is your brain without psilocybin. This is your brain with psilocybin. Which do you want? So 19 out of 19 patients 1 week after treatment and 47% after 5 weeks of treatment had a decrease in the default mode network, which is your instinctive, sort of standard operating consciousness, where you're able to then repattern neurological responses and come up with new ways of thinking and new ideas. So let's look at the bee shaman. This is from Sicily. The first image you're going to see, it's going to be 20 years to find this image, is the actual pictograph from the Sicilian Ajar Plateau, the labyrinthine cave complex in northern Algeria of over 5,000 BCE, 7,000 years ago. Now, and mushrooms were traditionally stored in honey. So the association of magic mushrooms and honey goes back thousands of years. In Mesoamerica, this is well known. And interestingly, under pressure of the Catholic Church, mushrooms were banned from beer in the Bavarian Beer Purity Act of 1516. So, that's when pagans and thus from European ancestry were having psychoactive meads, and we're in the forest, and we're celebrating nature, we're recoupling. Their lifespans were so short, and so the need to have another partner was extremely high. So this is the original image on the cave, and then it was redrawn by Cat Harrison and redrawn by a friend of mine, Jonathan Meter. But it is quite clear, 7,000 years ago, what this artist wanted you to know. Mushrooms are really important, you know. And mushrooms associated with bees are really important for keeping the mushrooms, ready at hand. So how much and how many of these threads of knowledge have been cut? We just have a little bit. What happened if the libraries of Alexandria had never been burned? Think of that. 2 million texts were burned. One of them that survived, I believe I'm accurate on this, predicted the diameter of the Earth within 60 miles. It was like amazing. So it's amazing that we're here today. We were resting on the shoulders and the ashes of our ancestors. So we go forward, and then in 400 BCE, Demeter is giving Persephone a mushroom before she goes into the underworld. This is the origination of the Greek mythology of the seasons. And upon Persephone consuming the mushroom, she goes down into Hades, or with Hades, into the underworld. That's the onset of winter. And then when she returns, that's spring. Well, look at how Demeter is presenting the sacrament. Presente. This is how Maria Sabina presents it to our Gordon Wasson. This is my brother John, and this is how we present the mushrooms. This is not, here, take these. It's like, look at this. This is important. Pay attention. This is a sacrament. And I think this is a universal hand gesture that many of us use when we're passing something of significance to somebody else where we want them to focus and pay attention. So in May 13th, 1957, in the middle of the Cold War, millions of Life magazines showed up on the doorsteps of Americans, which had a very good field guide to identifying magic mushrooms in Mexico by Roger I'm here and R. Gordon Wasson, who was a Morgan Trust banker. And he went on to write a number of books with Valentina, his wife, his Russian wife, including Mushrooms, Russia, and History, and as well as a great monograph called Les Champignons hallucinogènes du Mexique. And so, seeking the magic mushroom, the Life editors, Life magazine editors, got to choose the title, but R. Gordon Wasson said, you can't change anything in my text. That was the deal that he made with them. So magic mushrooms, the term, was donned by the editors of Life magazine. And then all over, well, in the Pacific slopes of Guatemala, these mushroom stones were found. And the conquistadors, when they came over from Spain into Mesoamerica in the 1500s, an edict passed by the Pope was to destroy all effigies that were representative of indigenous religion. And so these mushroom stones were destroyed by the thousands. The conquistadors brought disease, venereal disease, pox viruses, flu viruses. In medical terms, the population of Mesoamerica was immunologically naive. They had no history of contact. They had no antibodies to fight these, massive disease. And so, as a result, what was that? Probably Bill Gates saying you have to update your software. So these mushroom stones, there's only about 200 of them in existence today. And they thought to be either symbols of maybe the coat of arms of a family, maybe to mark a mushroom patch or property, maybe to invoke rain, because Mesoamerica, one of the diebacks of the civilizations related to droughts, we don't know. But they turned up oftentimes in farmers' fields when they were plowing them, hundreds of years later. This is Michael Pollan and myself, and I am the temporary custodian of 17 of these mushroom stones. And I take this, I'm not going to live as long as the mushroom stones have been around, so I'm only here for one generation. I want to repatriate them back to the Mayan people. I've had several Mayan elders as well as people associated with the Guatemalan government saying, don't you dare. Yeah, you're safer with you than they are. We're taking them back to Guatemala. They'll be sold into the art market. Unfortunately, the history of corruption down there is so bad. So in my will, my destiny is to have these returned, and hopefully on a ceremony to a Mayan temple. So a shaman came to visit me, and I had them all in boxes. And they said, Paul, they want to be out. And so I had this epiphany. Why don't I have a community of families represented by these mushroom stones, all in unison? And so I put this together, and it was so profound and powerful. This is resident in my house. I walk and look at this every day. I feel like I'm carrying the torch now to pass to future generations the heritage and wisdom of mushrooms and their use for future generations. This is a sacred and difficult responsibility, but a responsibility that I hold to be very dear. So this is my brother John Stamets, and John went to Yale, and I grew up in a fairly large house in Ohio, Columbiana, Ohio, and I was the youngest one of 5 kids in the family. Now my dad went to Cornell, my brother John went to Yale, my brother Bill went to Cornell, and but I was the youngest one in the family. We had a complete laboratory in the basement. I mean, 3 rows of chemical shells. My brother John was very excited about chemistry. That's why we went to major in at Yale. But he'd never let me play in the laboratory. But we had the radio, the main radio from the aircraft carrier, the Intrepid, in our basement. My dad served on the Intrepid aircraft carrier. After World War II, he got the main radio. So we had it in the basement. So I was listening to all these coded messages behind the iron curtains, strung these huge antennas, between, glass insulators across the trees in my yard. And I'd listen to coded messages, but I could play in there. But I was always in love with my brother John. He was 5 years my senior. But he eventually went to Yale, and he left the laboratory fully intact, and now I had free reign over it. So I was so excited. Any experiments that said, I'm sorry, Mike, danger, do not bring near flame, that was my experiment. I wanted to build rocket thrusters. And anyhow, so John left, and then he came back from Yale, and he brought this book, Altered States of Consciousness. And I'm just John went down to Mexico and Colombia, had these incredible mushroom trips. He was telling me about them. I was like, oh my gosh, my brother is so cool. But I said, John, he was on break, and he'd go back in 2 weeks, and I said, can I borrow this book? And he goes, yeah, but I need it for my class, so you can borrow it, please bring it back. And so John lent me the book, and my friend, Ryan Snyder, he and I tagged along together, and Ryan hung out with me in the laboratory and things like that, listened to the radio. And Ryan said, well, can I borrow the book? And I go, well, you can, but my brother John needs it back in a few days. So Ryan borrows the book. And a few days later, I see Ryan, I go, hey, Ryan, how's the book going? John's asking about it, need to give it back to him. So he goes, oh, fine. A few days later, Ryan, I need the book back, and now he's hesitating and making excuses and avoiding the conversation. And finally I said, Ryan, where's my brother's book? And Ryan sheepishly looked at me and says, Paul, I can't give it back to you. And I go, why? He goes, my dad found it and burned it. I said, your dad burned my brother's book? And I had to tell my brother, who's my hero, that I can't give you back the book. Ryan Snyder's father found it and burned the book. And John was extremely upset, really, I won't trust you again, But I thought to myself later on, that's probably one of the pivotal experiences of my life, that I thought, if this book so inspired somebody and they feared it to burn it, then I think I found the subject I wanted to explore. Now, I was always trying to impress my brother, as it was obvious, and John got me into mushrooms, and then I pursued it with a passion. And before I met Michael Bugh, I was up near Darrington, Washington, living in a remote cabin under a volcano, and I was being self-taught, learning about the mushrooms. And so I was always trying to impress John that, but my interest is legitimate. It's legitimate. And John was always playing the big brother scene. And so finally, I was very honored. 3 years ago, I received the Invention Ambassador Award for the American Academy for the Advancement of Science, AAAS, that produces Science Magazine. It's the most prestigious scientific organization by some, in the world. And so I finally got legitimized. I had to go through a gauntlet of peer reviewers and interviewers, and I was chosen to communicate science to the public. And there's 7 of us, including the inventor of digital photography, so we're in the inaugural class. So I got really excited to call my brother John, saying, John, I got third-party confirmation. What I'm doing is legitimate. So I got really, really excited. I called my brother up on a Friday night, and I called him a few times, and he didn't answer the phone. And that is the night my brother John died. He died from a heart attack. I never got to tell him. But it's because of his mentorship, and really he was very kind to me, despite the grief that he gave me. It was the older brother grief of trying to train the younger brother to be stronger, better, and smarter. So I have learned through my life, and big shout out to Michael Bugue here, is the extension of kindness to students when they're ignorant and innocent, bashful and shy and nervous and uncertain. Is that extension of hand of generosity and not shaming them, but encouraging them through their ignorance to become better. That's the foundation of my success. So other individuals, so here's Michael Bugue. He still looks the same. He doesn't age. But there's Dr. Daniel Stuntz, Professor Emeritus, University of Washington, and Daniel Alexander Smith, University of Michigan, in Kits Case. These four individuals were absolutely pivotal in my life. Now, Mike was sort of kind of on the liberal side of the fence, but these other individuals were not so liberal. It was amazing because I came out of the mountains in the Cascades, and I walked into Michael Bugue's office the first time, and this is what I looked like. Your suspicions have now been confirmed. Okay? And that is my first cook of Psilocybe cubensis in the kitchen. My brother John took this photograph. And there's great stories. I don't have time to tell them, but they're in one of my books called Psilocybin Mushrooms of the World, The Great Boat Street Patch, 50,000 specimens. We had to pick them all. And every square foot of my brother John's house at the University of Washington was covered with psilocybes, which we had the bioassay. But under Michael's, I still don't understand how to explain this, but Dr. Michael Bugue had 3 students, in particular, Jonathan Ott, Jeremy Bigwood, and myself. And collectively, we have produced 15 to 20 books on psychedelic mushrooms and plants. And also, Michael and Jeremy wrote some of the articles that are still referenced today on the proper analytical methods chemically for detecting psilocybin and psilocin. So it just became a vortex. And at that time, when it was discovered that these psilocybe mushrooms, you didn't have to go to Mexico or South America. They were growing in the Pacific Northwest, especially in Oregon and Washington, in Northern California. Then there was a sudden surge of interest. And that surge of interest, a lot of it also was steered by Ken Kesey, a great Oregonian. And so Ken and I had several things in common besides mushrooms. We also like chainsaws. And so Ken and I have very few skills, but one of them is I'm pretty damn good with a chainsaw because I was a logger for a number of years. So Ken and I were talking about chainsaws and all this other stuff. So I said, hey, Ken, I'll make this for you. Sporus de Illuminatus, 200 million spores of Psilocybe azurescens that you can put in the chainsaw bar oil. And as you're cutting your alder trees, you're going to be inoculating them with psilocybin mushrooms. And then when I was tripping one time, I came up with this mantra, Omni Psilocybe Munda, Omni Psilocybe Munda, Third Planet Productions. I know, it's kind of fun. So, and then in the mid-1970s, R. Gordon Wasson, came to the West, and Daniel Stuntz and Dr. Gaston Guzman wrote the world's monograph. Dr. Daniel Stuntz is holding a species that later would be named after him, Psilocybe stuntzii. And then in the 1976, there was the first psychoactive mushroom conference. And there's the Gaston Guzman, Gary Menser, and Seth Menser, I think, is in the audience here with his granddaughter. Gary was a giant of an individual. Unfortunately, he died. And I don't know the name of this person. There's Stephen Pollack, myself, and Dale Leslie. Now, the 3 of us, this group here, all jumped into a vehicle, not Gary, but the rest of us, and we drove from Northern California and we went to Ken Kesey's place and hung out there, and we went all the way up to British Columbia, and almost every place we stopped, we found psilocybes. In Vancouver, British Columbia, we pulled up to park the car. We parked the car, we opened up the door, and there's psilocybe cyanescence by the hundreds, right where we parked. They're like, how does that happen? It kept on happening over and over and over again. It was like the mushrooms are leading us. And we crossed into the Canadian border. I remember the Canadian border guy goes, you guys don't look like you would actually associate with each other. Because Gaston was so conservative, and we're all these like crazy looking hippie guys. So then Terence McKenna, Andy Weil, Gary Menser, and then Stephen Pollock. So unfortunately, only Andy in this picture is alive today. But I knew Stephen Pollock quite well. And Stephen Pollock was murdered when I was on the phone with him. I had not talked to Steve in probably a year. And Steve was trying to patent Psilocybin tamponensis for a treatment against autism, because he had some autistic children, and he was giving doses of the sclerotia of Psilocybin tamponensis, and he found that they were breaking out of their autistic behavior. They actually were communicating and were radical change in behavior, so he wanted to file a patent on Psilocybin tamponensis in treating autism. I disagreed vociferously with Steve, and I'm happy to say that, because I don't see the canvas as black and white or people like that. There's shades of gray. But Steve wanted to patent a new species. I go, you can't patent a new species out of nature. But then I found a precedent with Campbell's soup. They had a fungus they did patent. It was a new species. And so I called Steve up one night saying, Steve, I don't agree with your patent application, but in all honesty, here's some evidence that could help you. Steve was really busy. Paul, I said, Steve, it's just a 3-sentence reference. Call me back. He was really busy, and he hung up the phone, and then I call him back, and he goes, I go, okay, he kept on getting interrupted. And if you read this story by Hamilton Morris, I was at the Telluride Mushroom Conference, and I called out the audience. If there's a journalist in here, I have a story for you about the death of Stephen Pollock. And so I called him a third time, and now I'm getting a little frustrated. Steve, this is to your advantage, not to mine. Write down the friggin' reference, will you? Quit getting interrupted. And he goes, I'm sorry, Paul. Listen, someone's at the door. Call me back later. I go, the third time I'm going to call you back? He goes, no, I have to go. He hung up the phone, opened up the door, 357 Magnum in the back of his head, and he was murdered. I was the last person I talked to him. The story gets totally bizarre. 2 years later, at a thrift shop, someone buys an old tape recorder. There's a tape in the tape recorder. Buys it for $5. I was going to throw the tape away, but thought, what the heck? I'll listen to the tape. Undercover operation internally within the San Antonio Police Department to capture on tape a corrupt cop who admits to killing the mushroom doctor, Stephen Pollock, on tape. I get word that this tape exists. I go, this is totally weird. How is this possible? And I hear a portion of the tape, and he's saying, did you kill the mushroom doctor? And the cop says, yes, I did. I offed him. He had $200,000 cash in his house. So I told this journalist, Hamilton Morris, he tracks it down, he finds the tape. It's an excellent read. It's spooky, but Steve Pollock had some wonderful attributes about him. He had some negative ones, but his contribution in looking at curing neuropathy and psychological diseases centered on psilocybin, I think he was way ahead of his time. So later on, then I realized that I knew the very pranksters, and then I also knew the psychedelic chemists. Why don't we bring them together for a conference at Brighton Bush Hot Springs? And so there's Andy Weil, there's Terence McKenna, there's Gary Linkoff, the Shulgins are there, Sasha and Ann Shulgin, that's me, and so we had 130 people, 40 presenters, the rest of them were attendees, and I lost control of the conference. There was a giant witch's brew, and there's about 10 species of psilocybin mushrooms, Psilocybin cyanescens, Baeocystis, Cynofibulosa, Semilanceata, on and on. And after, at 10, 11 at night, the witch's brew was consumed. You had 140 people tripping their brains out. all dressed up for Halloween, dancing to fabulous reggae music, and I end up going over to the pot going, I'm done. I cannot do this conference again. So that was the end of the Myco Media conferences that some of you attended. But the conferences did continue, in Amsterdam and elsewhere, in Palenque, where Jonathan Ott and Terrence and McKenna and I taught at numerous conferences. Lots of books were coming out on psilocybin mushrooms. Some of them are really, really bizarre, highly inaccurate, dangerously inaccurate. But I love this book. This is the Golden Guide to Hallucinogenic Plants, what every 8th grader needs to learn about, right? Immediately taken off the market. These are collector items worth $500 a piece. And then 4 of my books here, and psilocybin mushrooms are allies, and psilocybin mushrooms, the world's growing gourmet medicinal mushrooms, etc. So Psilocybin Cubensis began the Psilocybin Cubensis Scholarship Fund in universities and colleges all over the world, where students would grow psilocybin mushrooms in their closets, and no one really made much money at this. They were just paying tuition, kind of reinvigorating the local economy, by helping the universities get paid their tuition. But the psilocybin mushroom cultivation spread all over. And then Dr. Michael Bew, and then because of his expertise, was able to write a seminal article accurately identifying psilocybin from other dimethyltryptamines. And then this was published, and so Michael was in a perfect position, being a chemist, to apply for a Drug Enforcement Administration license, which Michael did, and we received, and myself and Jeremy Bigwood were covered under the umbrella of this license. So I discovered and named then 4 new psilocybin mushroom species: Psilocybin azurescens, Liniformis, Variety americana, Sarnaphilosa, and Wiley. And I believed everybody was a DEA agent, because we became super popular and we became really paranoid because everybody wanted to get close to us, and so we just thought they have to be DEA. They wouldn't be this friendly to us otherwise, right? But so I came up with a motto, and I still abide this today: nature provides, I don't. Okay? I don't cross that line for lots of reasons. Not only is legally puts me in jeopardy, but I don't want to be responsible for somebody's bad trip. Think about that. You give somebody psilocybin mushrooms and they have a bad trip. You own part of that. Did they use it responsibly? Did you give them enough information? I think that's really important. That's why I think the therapeutic and controlled use of these, is much more important than the recreational use. So be it as it may, we evolve, we get better, we develop traditions and rituals that indigenous peoples have developed over thousands of years. We haven't had those. So I'm going to show you, I just decided this year to release these. These are in my vault. So I'm going to show you a few little short movies. But here's one on Psilocybin azurescens, the most potent psilocybin mushroom in the world. Greetings, and meet Psilocybin azurescens. Psilocybin azurescens is probably one of the most potent mushrooms in the world. It contains psilocybin and psilocin up to 2% of its dried mass. Now think of that. 2% of the dried mass of this mushroom are psychoactive crystals. Why would a mushroom produce so much? We don't know, but it certainly has attracted the interest of humans. The bluing that you see here is a bruising reaction. It's indicative of psilocin as it degrades. And the more bluing you see, the more psilocin there once was. Now, psilocybin dephosphorylates into psilocin, and when you ingest these mushrooms, psilocin becomes a serotonin agonist. It means that the psilocybin or the psilocin becomes a temporary neurotransmitter, opening up the floodgates of the senses. Now, this mushroom is sinuous. It's got a sinuous stem, which means it bends back and forth. It's bluing very, very strongly, and it has these very indicative spore color here on the annular zone. And the spore color is purple-brown, and the mushrooms are bluish. Those two features in combination pretty much de facto determines its psilocybin. Now look how bodacious the rhizomorphs are at the base of the stem. This is a large psilocybin, by far the largest one that I know that grows on wood chips in the Pacific Northwest. It is now a popular one to have in your backyard. It's just fun. It's just naturalized in the woods here. And this is a beautiful fruiting of them. And the psilocybins, many of the woodland psilocybins have this chestnut brown to caramel color. This one is unique in that it's got these umbos, and it's a broad umbo, and
The cap is very circular. The bruising reactions just from impact of rain, perhaps. This mushroom is one of the most fascinating and interesting ones to grow. Those who choose to partake of this mushroom should be warned. These are exceptionally potent, and oftentimes they can cause temporary paralysis, loss of muscle control. So that is not a good thing. It seems that most people who boil this mushroom in hot water, those symptoms seem to be alleviated. But this is clearly a sacred species, and I love just personally touching it. This is not a mushroom that I enjoy eating. It's almost too potent for me. But it is a species that I greatly admire. I love touching it. I love handling it. I love seeing it. And it's a great indicator of the habitat in my magical mushroom forest that is very conducive to spiritual experiences.
So, another species that is much rarer, but really important to point this out for the medical record, especially for the number of medical researchers that are here who will be seeing this talk, is Psilocybin beocystis. Psilocybin beocystis is very different than the caramel-colored other psilocybes. It's associated with Douglas fir, but it's very, very dark in color. And a family of 5 in Kelso, Washington in 1961 or 1962 early consumed these mushrooms over several days, and one child ended up dying. And so at the University of Washington, samples were sent, and Dr. Alexander Smith was given samples of a mushroom that was thought to be similar. The mushrooms that were consumed, no specimens survived, some stomach material survived. Alexander Smith then identified the mushrooms as being Psilocybin beocystis. And then a compound was identified called beocystin, named after Psilocybin beocystin, putatively being suggested maybe this is the indole compound that caused the death of the child. Well, there's Psilocybin beocystis, and that's Psilocybin cyanescens. That's the specimens of Psilocybin beocystis that Smith was supposedly identified that were representative of what was consumed in Kelso, Washington in this scientific report. These mushrooms resemble cyanescens, they do not resemble beocystis. Moreover, and this is the most important fact that I want to communicate, I have tried, under the DEA license, I cloned Psilocybin beocystis many times, barely ever grew. Thin, wispy mycelium always died back. I never got it to grow well. Psilocybin cyanescens, when you grow it, it's fabulous, rhizomorphs, beautiful growth. Because in the article, they took spore material and they germinated it and they put it into a media flask and they got luxurious growth. That doesn't happen, folks. Psilocybin beocystis, I can assure you, all the times I tried to grow it, I couldn't get it into culture and stabilize the culture to get any sort of thick mycelium whatsoever. So that also suggests that this mushroom was the one that was responsible with cyanescens, not beocystis. The compound should not be called beocystin, it should be called cyanescin. It's a misnomer. But beocystin is legal today. The analog drug law may cover it, not known, but psilocybin dephosphorylase into psilocin. This is a methylated form of beocystin, a methylated form of psilocybin, and it is different basically up here in this branch. So it may be that beocystin is also a psilocybin analog that we should look at for therapeutic use. I'm not sure about the legalities of this, but this is something that should be explored because this is a compound that maybe confer the benefits of psilocybin in a uniquely different way. Other species are Psilocybin stuntzii, named after Dr. Daniel Stuntz, University of Washington, a new species called Psilocybin allinii. Psilocybin semilanciata, many of you know about that, liberty caps. Psilocybin pelliculosa, this is the only one I find in the old growth forest that's native. It's the only one I find, deep in the forest, where all the other psilocybes, the woodland psilocybes, are all associated with wood chips. Psilocybin cyanescens, to the best of my knowledge, has never been found in a native environment. Yeah, we have a professor, if I could probably say this, okay, Dr. Paul Przybylowicz, totally straight guy, at the Evergreen State College, and he got loads of wood chips, and he gave it to his friends. And they said, they were really excited, said, Paul, all these psilocybin cyanesins came out of your wood chips. He was horrified. But it turns out, from my estimation, about 1 out of 4 truckloads of alder chips will carry psilocybin cyanesins to your yard. And that suggests that it's endemic and maybe an endophyte inside of alder trees. It's associated with them, but it's not presented until you chip the wood and you kill the tree. We don't know. We don't know where the ecosystem in the wild is for psilocybin cyanesins. So, here's another movie.
Throughout the temperate regions of Europe and the Pacific Northwest, one of the most interesting psilocybes to collect is one that grows near ponds in the grass. And this field has not had cows on it for more than 10 years. So cows and sheep can help, but they're not necessary. And this is Psilocybe similanciata, the famed liberty cap. It's exquisite little fruiting here. It's got a translucent striate margin. You can see the striations. They're actually the gills showing through the cap. And the cap also has a separable gelatinous pellicle. So here is one over here that we can look at. And as you tear the cap, there is a film that's clearly visible. And you can say, whoa, that's a really big one. That film stretches and then breaks. So these mushrooms are purple-brown spores, a separable gelatinous pellicle, and they typically have a sharp umbo or nipple at the very, very top of the cap. And this papilla or nipple is not always in every specimen, but it's quite characteristic of the species in general. So Psilocybe similanciata. Many people, when they pick similanciata, they don't realize that the stem is so long. I think it's a mutualistic species with the rhizomes of grass, almost like a pseudo-mycorrhizal relationship, which means it's not obligatory, but it benefits from it. And the stems often are picked because people don't realize that the stem length goes way, way down. So be careful. Always try to get the base of the stem if you can.
Okay, so let's look at some of the research with the psilocybin mushrooms. There was a great presentation earlier that talked about this, but Johns Hopkins really was one of the early institutions that did clinical studies showing that mystical type experiences extended even 14 months later. As stated, about 70% of people at 30 milligrams had a extraordinarily beneficial experience that they would state it was the most in the top 5 experiences of their life. Some people said that the most mystical experience of their life. And the positive experiences lasted well beyond more than a year from the time of the experience, and remembering the experience led to a positive psychological outcome and mood. The individuals who had a negative experience, the negative experience did not extend more than the experience itself. They just said, oh, I'm not going to do that again. So it's very interesting. Now, when they lowered, I talked to the researchers at Johns Hopkins, when they lowered the dose from 30 milligrams to 10 milligrams, everybody had a positive experience. At 30 milligrams, it was just too intense of a trip. It was, people were unsettled by it. So this is very interesting. Now, a number of studies have come out. These are fascinating. Now, association is not necessarily causation, but it can be. Let's not discount this. 480,000 people surveyed by HHS, and psilocybin use was associated with a 27% decreased odds of larceny and theft, 22% decrease of odds for property crime. This is with prisoners. People who trip on psilocybin mushrooms are less prone to have criminal behavior. Well, and it's also then 1,266 community members aged between 16 and 70. This is a study that is just coming out in 2018, shown that a negative relationship between psychedelic use and intimate partner violence. People who trip tend not to be violent to their partners. Now, very curiously, in this survey, it was isolated to men, not women. Men who tripped tend not to beat their spousal partners or have violent acts against them. Extraordinary. Now, and another one is responsiveness into depression, to reconnect with their emotions, When you are depressed, you're not as creative. And when you're depressed, immunologically, studies have shown your immune system is also depressed. You're more susceptible to disease. You're not as productive in society. You're not as creative. You're not contributing as much. So this is a way of breaking out of the depressive cycle and becoming more creative. A reset mechanism has been proposed specifically, and this has been talked about by others. And then at Johns Hopkins, and it's extraordinary because Dusty and I, my wife and I, made 20 of these mushroom stones, and the mold broke. And we did our castings that we made, and our mushroom stone ended up at Johns Hopkins with right beside people that had 700 trips, so like, I was there, So Louis Schwartzberg and I are making a movie. He's a great ally. It's called Fantastic Fungi. He's been making it for the past 12 years. And Louis sends his greetings, and the movie is extraordinarily well done. It'll be coming out here in the next few months. But Louis was able to give me permission to show you a clip from the movie. And so this is an extraordinary clip that he's put together. Louis Schwartzberg, Fantastic Fungi from Moving Art Productions.
Anyone who's had one of those experiences in a country where it's not legal to have them is stuck in this position where something really precious and really giving a great gift to you is not understood by the culture at large, and furthermore puts you or other people and other people at risk of prosecution. And one response to that is to get angry and to want to fight that. And another response to it is to say, we just got to explain to people what's going on here. And when people understand it, then there will be accommodation and respect.
I've been diagnosed with prostate cancer. My diagnosis was so bad that it was, they weren't giving me any chance whatsoever.
My diagnosis was kidney cancer. Finding out that you may want to get your affairs in order.
I first found out about the study when my oncologist gave me a pamphlet. He said, here's something that might be able to help you with the anxiety. And I was accepted into the study.
The most important thing is to remember that you're always safe. And a recommendation is that whatever is coming up, that you allow it, that you don't have to like it, but you say, okay, rather than trying to run away from it. Once a volunteer is enrolled in the study, they're with us for the preparation, the psilocybin sessions, and the integration follow-ups after. I have been a guide for around 350 psilocybin sessions, and then about 1,000 of the preparatory and integration meetings.
All right.
Okay. Okay, lift your head up. It's really just about experiencing what comes up as the psilocybin takes effect.
And the intense part of this journey, this world and things that matter to most people, family and all that, that wasn't even what it was about. They say anything mystical can't be explained. It's something like that. It's a feeling of such immense power that you can't even imagine. I've never felt anything like it before. It was about being in a place of infinite space and just being there.
There's an experience of positive mood, sometimes open-heartedness, love, transcendence of time and space, and then finally it's thought to be ineffable. People say, I can't describe that experience.
In my mind, I said, okay, hold it. If I give myself over to you, can you promise me that I will be in at least as strong a shape was when I entered this room. And I felt a voice that I needed to heed. Do you think I would disrespect my own handiwork? This is the voice from on high saying, do you think I would disrespect my child? And I felt so beautiful. I felt like I have never felt before. My sense of being loved, of being worthy of love, of being cared for, of being important to someone. It's huge.
Going into it, doing beautiful.
One-third of individuals in the study said it's the single most spiritually significant experience of their lives. About 70% say it's among the 5 most personally meaningful experiences of their lives. And you say, well, so what does that mean, you know? And initially I thought, I wonder if they don't have pretty dull lives. But no, people would say, you know, when my firstborn came into this world, I'll never forget that. And life has never been the same since. Or my father passed away. That was deeply moving to me. I'm different now in the world. And so, you know, it's kind of like that.
The most glorious part was that it made me feel more comfortable with living, you know, because you're not afraid of dying.
Frankly, I'm just a laboratory scientist, and I wasn't prepared for that.
From the memory of the transcendental state of consciousness, many people report less anxiety, less depression, less preoccupation with pain, closer interpersonal relationships, and perhaps most impressive, they claim to have a loss of the fear of death.
It recalibrates how they see death. It's been amazing hearing them talk about this idea of love. Many of them spoke about how nature itself is something like this substance called love. And having touched that, they've recalibrated it and shaped how they die differently.
Thank you, Louis Schwarzberg. There's a cascade of research coming out. 2017, 2018, there's about 20 new articles. If you do Google Scholar Alerts or take a student to this, there's a lot for, especially for treatment of psychiatric disorders for which there are no other drugs that are working. So interesting that it also changes their perception of the view of the environment. With the use of psychedelics predicts a pro-environmental behavior. This is a large-scale survey, 1,487 people. And then from the experiences with psilocybin, they felt more connected with nature. For us that hunt these mushrooms, when we pick these mushrooms, we understand the mycelial network that is underneath them. We are reconnecting literally to the web of life of nature. These fungal networks are the foundation of the food chain. They have helped steer the evolution of our ecosystems and indeed our own species. And for treatment-resistant depression, Article 2018, increased nature-relatedness and decreased authoritarian political views. Yet again. Pranksters, we need you. So, and then Silicon Valley is now using psilocybin mushrooms for microdosing to increase coding ability. I have intimate personal knowledge of coders at some of the largest internet companies. You know all of these, you use them every day. And many of their coders are now doing tripping on psilocybin on a daily basis. Psilocybin and chocolate, by the way, that seems to be the preferred. And on the psilocybe cubensis scale, you're looking at between 1/10, and 0.5 grams. The threshold liftoff is 1 gram, you're getting pretty good dose, but 5 grams is the hero's journey on psilocybe cubensis. And you're doing doses, and then you acclimate it to it very quickly. You don't feel any change. I think those doses are a little bit high. But nevertheless, it speaks to what I call epigenetic neurogenesis. Maybe now this is the time for the next paradigm shift. Maybe this is the time now that we need to have an expansion in human consciousness to come up with the creativity, the codes necessary to solve the problems that we face today, which are monumental by every estimation. So now, a study that is in press right now, Dr. Roland Griffiths at Johns Hopkins is pushing for psilocybin to be rescheduled from Schedule 1 to a Schedule 4. Drugs have no potential, very low potential for abuse. And this study is in press. Roland and the team emailed me today. And this is something that I think we should really look at, because if it is rescheduled from Schedule 1, not to Schedule 2, but to Schedule 4, and those of you who've tripped on these mushrooms, you know the experience. After a Herculean hero's journey, the next day you look at the mushroom and you go, no way, touch those. I'm done. As Terence McKenna said, when you get the message, hang up the phone, right? So these are not mushrooms of abuse potential. I do think they should remain legal in the sense that I don't want somebody driving down a country road. I live out in the country, tripping on cubensis. I think we need to have some type of structure there. Under controlled settings, of course, you don't want to be running a nuclear power plant or driving, flying an airplane, on these mushrooms. So reasonable constraints need to be put into place. So psilocybe azurescens, psilocybe cyanescens, and now look at the difference. Psilocybe cyanescens on the left there, psilocybe azurescens. Azurescens is a much larger species. So I've come up with something, and I dare to present this, and I'm presenting this now for the benefit of those people who have DEA licenses, who are chemists, and who will fully abide by the rule of law. Okay? That should cover me, I hope. But I discovered something very bizarre called blue juice. And this is really antithetical to the basic chemistry analytical methods, because usually you want to use solvents and heat extracts things better. But I found if you chop fresh mushrooms up and you put them in a jar with ice cubes, and then you let the ice cubes melt over about 5 days, 33, 35 degrees, 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, then you can extract out the psilocybin and psilocin without extracting out the beta-glucans and all the heavy molecular weight sugars. And so you can isolate the psilocybin in cold water and make ice cubes for Burning Man. Again, purely for research purposes. But this could be helpful in fractionating out. So chemists in the audience might look at this and think, wow, this is a very interesting fractionation sequence, because fractionation is very expensive, because you have to get rid of all the other junk. So, How to Change Your Mind. How many people here in this audience have read that book? Michael Pollan. And I want to introduce to you another, towards the end of my talk here, another mushroom, which is legal, which is a mushroom that also spurs neurogenesis, and that's lion's mane mushrooms. Lion's mane mushrooms have nerve growth stimulant factors that are cythine derivatives discovered by a mycologist in Japan called Kawagishi, who filed patents on it in 1994. It's off patent. I don't know how he came up with this. He was looking for antibacterial compounds, and he found that lion's mane mushrooms stimulate neurons to regrow. Moreover, it causes the remyelination, regeneration of myelin sheath on the axons of nerves. This is your conductive shielding that allows neurotransmission. And a number of experiments, 2 clinical studies have come out on mild cognitive dementia and also postmenopausal depression, showing statistically significant improvement for people taking 2 to 5 grams of this mushroom per day. Interestingly, with both study groups, when they stopped taking the mushrooms, then they regressed. Now, but there's a study specifically with mice, and this is the one that I'm most excited about. It's a behavioral study. And what they did is initially they had mice, and they put them into an arena, and then they had an exit door, and it was a t-test. Basically, they go left to get the food, the right they wouldn't get the food. So very quickly, the 100 mice realized, oh, go left to get the food, so they got that. So they have really good stats on that. And then they inject them with a psychopeptide that induced amyloid plaque formation, which is the degeneration of the myelin sheath that substitutes with amyloid plaque that interferes with neurotransmission, typical of Alzheimer's patients. Upon death and resection, they look for amyloid plaque formation in the brain. They can see this, and this is symptomatic of Alzheimer's patients and the progression towards dementia. So with those mice, when they inject them with the amyloid plaque, they would resect some of sacrifice some of the mice. They'd resect their brains. They would see the amyloid plaque formation. So they had the cause and effect of the cyclopeptide causing the amyloid plaque and the demyelination. Those mice then, when they went down the corridor, they then randomized. They couldn't remember. Short-term memory was lost. They couldn't remember which way to go. So when they fed those mice then for about 22 to 23 days, their behavior changed. They remembered, and then they statistically significantly then chose the corridor that led to the food. Upon sacrificing those mice and resecting their brains, they found a massive reduction of amyloid plaque formation and remyelination on the axons. Another study, it's far more interesting to me, they did with the mice. They had the mice in the arena, they put in a toy, and the mice explored the toy. That was all good and dandy. And they put in a new toy, and now with clickers, they did how many points of contact with the mice. How many mice came up to the new toy, sniffed it, explored it, and they got a very, very large data sets. They did the same thing, injected the mice with a psychopeptide that caused the amyloid plaque formation, demyelination, and then when they put in the second toy, there's no interest. On those mice, they then fed the lion's mane mushrooms. And it's the aranacines are coming from the mycelium, so to be specifically here, aranacines come from the mycelium, hericinones came from the fruit bodies. The aranacines are far more active than the hericinones, they found out later. But when those mice then were given the lion's mane, then they then re-explored and rediscovered novelty, inquisitiveness, creativity. Creativity leads to happiness, happiness leads to creativity. Depression leads to malaise, and lack of creativity doesn't contribute to society. So this is extraordinary, that this mushroom is perfectly legal and yet causes a massive, it's been described as the best nerve growth factors ever discovered in science thus far, causing remyelination and removing amyloid plaques. So there's a double-blind, placebo-controlled clinical patient that shows the cognitive function compared to the placebo group. And here's axons, and this is from Science Photo, and this shows what the amyloid plaque formations on the neurons of an Alzheimer's patient. That is what's removed, and it interferes with signal transmission. Remyelination occurs upon consuming the mushrooms. So here's more lion's mane mushrooms. Now there are other ones called bear's head, Hericimia biatus, and coralloides. These are the ones you commonly have in the old growth forest, in the second growth forest around here in Oregon. So if you wanted to study psilocybin, $7,000 a gram to buy psilocybin clinically. And it's got to be 99.8% pure. Anything less than that, the impurities have to be studied. So there's a high benchmark, and so this is very, very expensive. So I'm presenting to you a nootropic vitamin complex, a stacking formula for epigenetic neurogenesis, where you're combining psilocybin and aranacines, or psilocybe mushrooms and lion's mane mushrooms, and you're stacking it with niacin, nicotinic acid. Now I came up with this formula because it was well known, and I got more of the senior people in the audience, I can't quite see all of you. How many of you remembered in the 60s and 70s that if you want to come down from a psilocybin mushroom or an LSD trip, you would take niacin? Does anybody remember that? A show of hands? Yeah, numbers of people. Well, so, it it may not necessarily be true, but it was common knowledge. Now, niacin, vitamin B3 excites the endpoints of the nervous system. You get a red flush. Those of you taking vitamin B3, you get this red flush, you get itchy all over. So I thought, if the vascular system's intact and you want to create neurogenesis, oftentimes neuropathies occur at the endpoints of the nervous system, the toes and the fingers, deadening of the toes and the fingers, loss of sensation. If you could then excite those neurons by using vitamin B3 as a driver to bring psilocybin and erinacines to the endpoints of the nervous system, neurogenesis, then can repair the neuropathies that were occurring. That's what I'm suggesting, and that's what I want to study clinically. We have 3 groups in Canada right now that are quite excited about this. The FDA in the United States this past week told some researchers, Charlie Grobe and his group at UCLA that I'm working with, that they won't approve psilocybin mushrooms for a clinical study, even though it could be standardized. However, it goes from Schedule 1 to Schedule 4. They may change their tune on that. So this is something I think we all suffer. Our society in this country is losing intellectual capital due to dementia, Parkinson's diseases, Alzheimer's. This is a loss of knowledge. That knowledge has been accumulated at great expense. And for us to lose this knowledge in our society, not passing on to future generations, is robbing our generations in the future of the essential knowledge. It's like we are losing libraries of Alexandria every day. What if we could preserve those libraries and pass them on for future generations? How will that help the evolution of our species? It'll help enormously. So we all going to suffer from some form of neuropathy as we age. And even though you may not take psilocybin mushrooms, it's really interesting because I talked to some conservative people who never dare trip on LSD or magic mushrooms. But the concept of taking 1/20th of a dose and may leads to neurogenesis and prevents dementia, and they can kind of be cool with their kids and grandkids, That's really appealing. That's really appealing because the thing is the self-awareness of your encroaching dementia leads to depression. And to be able to be more creative, more cognitively astute, and as many of you know, one of the symptoms of eating these mushrooms is laughter. So this is something I think we should explore. I think this idea has legs. The idea of stacking these together. Now, lion's manes are a perfectly legal mushroom. You can go out and use these today. So I'm not advocating you breaking the law. But I think that we have to push the envelope here to come up with some of the creative solutions that we need today. So the other thing I want to mention, because a lot of researchers have missed this, and the mice were given low doses of psilocybin, it extinguished the fear conditioning response, more so than high doses. This is an argument for low dosing, microdosing. And this is what I think it should need to be explored. You don't have to give somebody a full-blown trip. Neurogenesis can occur at sub-threshold doses of you noticing that there's an effect. So this should be explored. There's credibility in this argument. Okay, well, it's not always safe out there to collect wild mushrooms. This is Galerana marginata. The new name for it is a photograph that I took with Psilocybe stuntzii and Galerana marginata are growing so close together they're touching each other. One is deadly poisonous. Galeranas are deadly poisonous. Many people have died from Galerana poisonings. Be aware. Join a mycological society. Be careful. Take spore prints. Get good field guides. One of the measurement that I use with guild mushrooms, if the spore print is purple brown and the mushroom is bruised bluish, with very few exceptions, it's highly probable you have a magic mushroom, a psilocybin producing mushroom. Those two things must be true. Purple brown spore prints and bruising bluish. Now there's a group called Stropharia cerulea. That's a bluish group of Stropharias. They're not thought to be that poisonous, and they don't have psilocybin in them. But largely that's true. If you have a purple brown spore print and the mushroom is bruised bluish, it's likely to be a psilocybin mushroom, but you need to do further tests and have it authenticated by an expert. So there are some light brown mushrooms, light spore brown mushrooms, that are active. And this is Gymnopolis luteofolius. It's indigenous, it's unique to alder trees here, and Alnus rubra, Alnus alda, in the Pacific Northwest. And this is a very rare species, very hard to identify, and it grows in very surprising locations. And here is a short clip of a very surprising location where I found it.
It only shows on boats. Okay, this is July 8th, 2011, and it's just hard to believe that Paul Stamets' boat will be growing a psychoactive mushroom, but it's true. I know it's not the best specimen right now, but this is Gymnophilus luteofolius. It is unique to alder. It's a very rare species. In fact, most mycologists would not be able to identify it. I just happen to have a specialty in this area. And it's so weird because my friend Clay here, hey Clay, he said he found a mushroom going off of a boat and he brought it to me from your friend, right?
At Harstein Island boat launch.
And it was also Gymnophilus luteofolius. So it begs the question now, is this mushroom indigenous to Northwest boats? And I've never found this in the wild. I've seen it at a Mycology society, but I go figure. Now, I'm not going to pick it, so I guess I'm not breaking the law. Or am I breaking the law because it's growing here and I know what it is? I don't know what to do. Anyhow, how bizarre. Gymnophilus luteofolius on Stamets' boat, and we've had more than one sighting of this on this boat and more than one boat now, 2 boats. So, go figure.
Now, this indeed may be why some of these species came over to North America from Europe. The pilgrims came over in boats, and then the boats were rotting, so they built houses out of it, and that became a mycological footprint on the shores of North America. Very plausible. So science on psilocybin is getting weird. It's so weird. So I don't know if you know about this. Here's Massospora cicadina. This is a cicada. Every 17 years, they come out of the ground. And it turns out, and I saw these in Ohio all the time, I actually saw ones that would be moldy like this, and it turns out that that mold is packed full of psilocybin. And so cicadas, when they're breaking out in the Midwest and they're getting this mold is packed full of psilocybin, it rots off their butt. And their butt falls off with the genitals. But then the cicadas are flying around, becomes hypersexualized, and then they will go to females and try to engage them with male courtship rituals, or they'll actually feminize themselves and go to males to attract males to copulate with them, even though they have no sexual organs, just so they can get in contact so the spores can be transferred to the adjacent cicada. Weird. So, where is this all going? Well, I think that I have no friggin' clue. But when you're having a cicada outbreak, in the future, I'm wondering what's going to be happening. Because I don't know what to say, So, but I do want to say this, and I want to end my talk with something that's important, I think, to all of us. My experience with psilocybin mushrooms and the kindness of the individuals that have helped me as leading to some paradigm-shifting breakthroughs. I'm restricted due to confidentiality, but on October 4th at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, what has been described as the most prestigious scientific journal in the world, it will be publishing an article by me. I'm the primary author, and 10 other co-authors, including USDA virologists, Washington State University entomologists, and I have come to a paradigm-shifting breakthrough that's absolutely critical to biosecurity across this planet. Now, I'm not going to say more, but you all will be hearing about this, I think. The press teams are involved, major PR firms are involved. It's a testimonial to support the importance of biodiversity for the continued survival on this planet. And that natural products will be more powerful than pharmaceuticals for a broader bioshield of benefits with less adverse reactions. This is a wedge discovery. It is paradigm shifting. I am so honored to be the messenger of this. And this is something that some of you have gotten wind of if you've seen my other work. But it comes from my brain being affected positively, I believe, by psilocybin mushroom experience and the reverence I have for nature. So if we have the lights down, I just want to finish with this short 2-minute clip. Mushroom mycelium represents rebirth, rejuvenation, regeneration. Fungi generate soil that gives life. The task that we face today is to understand the language of nature. My mission is to discover the language of nature of the fungal networks that communicate with the ecosystem. And I believe nature is intelligent. The fact that we lack the language skills to communicate with nature does not impugn the concept that nature is intelligent. It speaks to our inadequacy for communication. If we don't get our act together and come in commonality and understanding with the organisms that sustain us today, not only will we destroy those organisms, but we will destroy ourselves. We need to have a paradigm shift in our consciousness. What will it take to achieve that? If I die trying, but I'm inadequate to the task to make a course change in the evolution of life on this planet, okay, I tried. The fact is, I tried. How many people are not trying? If you knew that every breath you took could save hundreds of lives into the future, had you walked down this path of knowledge, wouldn't you run down that path of knowledge as fast as you could? I believe nature is a force of good. Good is not only a concept, it is a spirit. And so hopefully the spirit of goodness will survive. Are you on the bus or are you off the bus? Today is the day for the paradigm shift. I want to thank you all. Get on the bus. Thank you, pranksters. Thank you all. Let's go forward together.